A very good evening to you all and a very warm welcome. I'm really delighted to be welcoming you to this rather special occasion, and it's special for two reasons. First, the Nehru Memorial Lecture, which is hosted by the King's India Institute, endowed by the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Trust, is being held after the gap of a few years. The second reason why it's a special occasion is that the lecture is being delivered by Professor Madhavan Palat, who is uniquely qualified to speak on Nehru's ideas as they evolved in the last decade of his life. And the reason why I say, and those of you who know Professor Palat's scholarly work on Russia and the Soviet Union would be surprised to hear me say that, but the reason why he's uniquely qualified to speak on this phase of Nehru's life and thought is because over a period of 8 years between 2011 and 2019, he took on and successfully completed the truly monumental task of editing the last 40 volumes of the selected works of Jawaharlal Nehru. Professor Palat's immersion in Nehru's thinking and writing is unarguably deeper than that of anyone else, and he has chosen today to speak on Nehru's democratic dilemmas, Nehru's disenchantment with democracy, and this will come as a surprise to some of us, Nehru's disenchantment with democracy as it unfolded before his eyes in practice, but also simultaneously his unwavering commitment to it. Indian history and politics, as many of you know, have not been the central focus of Professor Palat's scholarly career. Born in 1947, he read history at the universities of Delhi and Cambridge, specializing thereafter in late imperial Russian history, a field in which he took his DPhil at the University of Oxford. Professor Palat taught European and Russian history at the Center for Historical Studies at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi from 1974 to 2004. He was visiting professor in Imperial Russian history at the University of Chicago in 2006, and between 2010 and 11, he was National Fellow at the Indian Institute of Advanced Study in Shimla. Professor Palat's publications have been mainly on a range of themes in the field of Russian and Soviet history, on workers, peasants, Eurasianism, Dostoevsky, Solzhenitsyn, Nikolai Roerich, nationalities, policies, and Central Asia. Most recently, he wrote the chapter on socialism in India in the Cambridge History of Socialism, published in 2022, and delivered in 2019 the Jawaharlal Nehru Memorial Lecture titled The Spiritual in Nehru's Secular Imagination. Before I invite Professor Palat to speak, it's not customary to have questions after a public lecture of this kind, but given that he's visiting from India for just a few days, we thought it might be a good idea to have a few minutes set aside for audience interaction at the end of the lecture. So Professor Palat would speak for about an hour, after which we'll try and apportion 10-15 minutes to audience interaction. And I will invite questions which, in the hope that they will be almost as erudite as the lecture, but certainly not as lengthy, and would request you, when you ask a question, to please speak into the microphone and introduce yourself very briefly. Just your name will be good enough. We are recording this lecture, and there will be photographs taken. So if you have any difficulty or you wish to withhold consent from this, please do let Vignesh or Meghna, Vignesh is the young man with the camera there, and Meghna's at the door. Please let one of them know, and we will make sure that that your wishes in this matter are respected. So with that, thank you once again for being here, and thank you, Madhavan. Professor Palat, please.
Thank you very much, Niraja, for your generous introduction. And let me thank King's India Institute for organizing this lecture in memory of Nehru, and especially for inviting me to deliver it on a subject of such importance, so close to his heart, and I suspect to our hearts also. There are few people who were more democratic than Nehru himself, although he had all the advantages of being a dictator should he have wanted to be so. And he was truly a person who felt that democracy is not reserved for some, but it has to be universal, in whether the country be rich or poor, and anywhere at any time. And he lived by that conviction, pursued it as an ideal in India, and to the extent that he could outside the country also, which is why he's remembered in those places where he pursued decolonization as an ideal for the 20th century. Within India, of course, he's left behind a very powerful legacy. And he also contributed, I think, immensely to the good relations between India and Britain, the personal relations, in that he considered it important that everybody be able to engage in dialogue. And nothing after the experience of colonialism should in any way lead to bitterness between the two peoples. And that was, I think, has been immensely successful. Even Churchill said, there's few people he's met who's so free of hatred and so free of fear. So that is one mark of the relationship that has been established, that we are able to have this lecture and have this discussion. So thank you very much. Let me get on with the lecture. Nehru was a liberal and social democrat by conviction, and he called himself a socialist all his life. Perhaps he was not quite as socialist as he imagined himself to be, but he certainly wanted to be one. The liberalism, he was protected by the Constitution. Democracy was enacted by massive movements and elections, and socialism was enabled by both, but not guaranteed by either. He wanted to give depth to liberalism through democracy, and he wanted to protect liberalism from democracy. That is one of his objectives. How successful he was is another matter, but this is certainly a major problem that he encountered, and his greatest fear was that the democracy that we have in modern times, that is in the 20th century, might degenerate into a form of plebiscitary dictatorship. And there's every danger that it might happen in India, and the temptation for him was enormous, as everyone informed him, and in fact invited him to be the dictator when the opportunity came. And all around him, there were so many such dictators, and he resisted the temptation, and he resisted the temptation to become either a dictator or a Mahatma, as one of his close friends, Jayaprakash Narayan, actually suggested to him. He said, "You're too great a man to be just a leader of the political party or a prime minister. Mahatma Gandhi is gone, you play the role now." Even that he declined the opportunity or the offer. Sorry. However, he was committed to democracy. He felt he had to justify why it was necessary and possible in India. And his justifications were historical and many other. The most important historical argument was that India has had a democracy for the past 30 years, that is 30 years before 1947 and during the Gandhian mobilization. And for the 50 years before that, there was a vibrant civic culture, was preparing the ground for democracy by its very able critique of colonialism, by which it delegitimized colonialism throughout the early nationalist phase. So not only had there been a democratic movement of great substance for 30 full years, Indian politics was democratic. The colonial state may not have been, but the rest of the politics was. And that would be carried on into independent India. Over and above that, he made a further historical argument that it was already founded in ancient panchayats, or the village councils from ancient and medieval times. I don't think he was very convinced about it, because that is a sort of argument that everyone in Europe had been making throughout the 19th century and around the world, that democracy always began in the German forests somewhere in prehistoric times. But he nonetheless tagged it on to his argument. It was useful to make it, to show that democracy is completely Indian. And that is particularly important to show because this democracy he saw as having been prepared by Indians mobilized against colonialism. It was anti-colonial, completely Indian, original in itself. It was not borrowed. There's a long thesis, as you know, that somehow Indians were taught by their colonial masters how to be democratic. There is even that inscription by Edward Lutyens on one of the portals of one of the great government buildings, which says people have to learn how to be free before they can get freedom. Lutyens, the man who built New Delhi. So this kind of an argument was commonly pushed in those times, and Nehru said, no, it was built entirely by Indians against a government and a system which is totally despotic. The British were democratic in Britain. They were the antithesis of that in India. So Indians had no way of learning about democracy from the British except from textbooks. And that naturally only a few could do. They did not learn it, they were familiar with it. That's all. So it was entirely original, it was Indian, had a long history, at least 30 years, very active history, 70 years altogether of critique and so on. And pushing the argument further, it goes back into antiquity. So there's a really good foundation for democracy, and that explains why it could happen afterwards. And he felt that independent India, under his guidance for the 17 years that he was Prime Minister, actually justified those. India had regular elections, very orderly, succession of governments. It all happened. And even a communist government was elected democratically, the very first one in the world, as people always used to say, in Kerala. And the foremost constitutional historian of India, an American historian, said this was impossible to conceive of in America, that you could have an elected communist government. But it happened here. So it all seemed justified and perfectly reasonable to make those claims, was his point. Now, when he saw this happening, he finally made the claim that democracy had entered the marrow of Indian culture, as it were. He called it the Yuga Dharma, in fact, the Dharma of the age, loosely translated, the zeitgeist. Indians were fully and utterly democratic. The systems they created was democratic, and that's how it's going to go on. Now, he had a problem, however, with making all these claims. He's a man who doubted everything he said and expressed those doubts. He doubted what others claimed. He doubted what he himself claimed quite often. And he expressed it quite freely. He said it had to be willed into being if it was to exist. Democracy is something that does not occur serendipitously. It is not imposed. It is not by accident. You have to will it into being. So you have to have an active citizen to do so. And that is what the Gandhian mobilization actually helped in doing. But it also had to be institutionalized. Without it, there cannot be a stable democracy. And here is where he first met the first of his problems. How do you have both the dynamism of the movement and the stability of the institution running simultaneously? And he was perpetually bothered about this. And every time he encountered the stabilization of a movement and the rigidity setting into it, his answers to it was not to turn to the Constitution and make more laws about it, which he found could always be perverted, but that you have to have more democracy. Democracy's problems will be solved by more of democracy, not less of it, and not by more institutionalization and more laws, which are just formal statements without effect if there was a problem with it, in fact. So his remedy was always the same. So the first step to institutionalizing democracy was the Constituent Assembly, as he imagined it back in the 1930s and 40s, when he campaigned very militantly for it. And he saw it as a revolutionary assembly that will create the constitution and define the future of India and create the ideal state of the future. This is always almost a fantasy of such revolutionaries or people of such militant temper as they approach the crucial hour. And his conditions for a successful Constituent Assembly and a result from it was that, number one, it should be created entirely by Indians. It should be of origin Indian. British should have no role in creating it or summoning it. And secondly, it should be by adult suffrage, so that the whole people of India shall be represented. Only then would it be a genuine assembly capable of carrying out the tasks that he had assigned it. And with that, he considered the British Act of 1935 a sort of temporary constitution, completely illegitimate, inadequate, and to be repudiated utterly because it is only a trick to suck Indian nationalists into a parliamentary politics. It is a sort of problem that Lenin faced also. You can see the same problem before the Russian Revolution. When the Duma was introduced, Duma politics was what Lenin called parliamentary illusions. Nehru was saying almost the same. So he said, go in for elections, mobilize around them, but on no account form ministries. To his dismay, all his colleagues formed ministries and were sucked into the corruptions of politics straight away. But this is a position he held and was very concerned about what was happening about his own colleagues in the party. His second condition was adult suffrage. Only then would there be a full representation, and only then would the assembly and the constitution that followed have legitimacy to claim for the foreseeable future. Now, the particular reason he wanted adult suffrage, besides the usual one that it had to be representative, was that whenever he went before the public, the responses were so enthusiastic. He was such a powerful leader. He was by far the most popular. He felt a surge of power just having the people attend his meetings and respond to them so enthusiastically. He felt that this is the power of the people. He believed in it almost in a French revolutionary sense. He could have been a Jules Michelet writing about the Indian revolutionary movement and in the Indian revolution that was to come. He spoke of the people exactly as they used to speak at that time, of the Le Peuple. And he went on that way, so enthusiastically. But his critics, and many historians subsequently, down to this day, have argued that it was a leap in the dark, it was somewhat foolish, and so on. How on earth can you have adult suffrage in a country that is almost totally illiterate? And Nehru found this an absurd argument because it assumed that educated people were somehow rational and based their judgments upon information, unlike illiterate people who are swayed. And he gave any number of examples that the opposite was the case. And the poor knew their interests as well as the rich did. And they knew whom to select as their leaders. And there's no ground to reject it on this, with this argument. He further argued that the Gandhian politics of the past 30 years had actually enfranchised the population of the country. So large were the mass mobilizations that it was something like adult suffrage that had already taken place. And if they could do so and observe the discipline that Gandhi had imposed upon them of nonviolence and act rationally, as rational as anybody who's educated and well-informed in parliamentary systems in advanced countries, well, what is the problem about it? So he did not accept it at all. So each time he went before the people and saw their responses, he was so enthusiastic that he was in fact inspired to poetic expression. And I must read to you the way he expressed it. It was straight out of the Rubaiyat of Umar Khayyam. It was, he's talking of the peasant, and his sunken eyes glistened, and his shrunken, starved body rose up in enthusiasm, and the wine of hope filled his veins. These are the terms in which he spoke of the masses of the country as he faced them. But he had a further reason. He discovered that all his opponents, the colonial state, the Hindu Mahasabha, that is Hindu nationalists, the Muslim League, all of them opposed adult suffrage. The very fact that they opposed it showed that they were really terrified of him winning it. And especially the Muslim League and the Hindu Mahasabha. The two communal forces he had to fight, Hindu and Muslim. And if that is the case, then all the more reason you need adult suffrage to overcome the great communal problem. If the people are allowed to participate 100% in the elections and in politics, then the great problem would be swept away, was his assumption. A bit naive, but there was some justification in it to this extent that he felt that they were being manipulated by their own elites. And if the people were allowed to participate, that would not be the problem. However, when the Constituent Assembly met in 1946, and he moved the resolution on aims and objects, he omitted the word democracy, as well as the word socialism. And everyone was most surprised. why these two words were not there. They were so dear to his heart. Why were they not there? He explained it by saying he did not want words that were divisive. Yes, socialism was divisive. Only he was socialist, the rest of the party was not. And he would have been in the company of the socialists and the communists. The Congress party which he led was not socialist in majority. But what about democracy? Why should he avoid the word democracy? Why didn't he want a democratic republic? He explained it rather lamely by saying democracy is contained in the word republic, which he knew to be totally false. From the Roman Republic to the Soviet ones, he considered them all to be anything but democratic. He's written about it and said so plainly. So on what ground can you possibly say democracy is necessarily contained in republic? But he had other reasons, and I suspect the reasons were the following. The Constituent Assembly, when it finally met in 1946, had been summoned by the British government. It was not the Grand National Assembly of the Indian people meeting on a revolutionary basis, representing everybody. It was a summons from the British Parliament. And his first disappointment was that. Secondly, the suffrage was very limited. It was about 28.5%. It's very difficult to work out, but something between 10 and 28.5%. So about 3/4 of the population, of the electorate, had been excluded from this. So it was anything but representative. It was not democratic, and the origin was the wrong one. It was British, not the Indian people. So it is not democratic as far as he's concerned. And the principal political parties are all missing. The Hindu Mahasabha, the Muslim League, the Socialists, the Communists were all out of it. Only the Congress was there, practically, with certain extras and whomever they could persuade to attend. So it would become a Congress constitution, as Mahavir Tyagi rather disparagingly said, and it actually did not represent the principal political parties. They were not there. So how would this be a democratic constitution that is coming? And would the result be democratic because of this constitution? No, it would not be. So he saw it is not the constitution that would ensure democracy, it would be the other way around. It would be democratic politics that would legitimize the constitution that is to come. And he always saw democratic politics as the solution to the problems of the inadequacies of the constitution, including the origins of it in this particular manner. Of course, we could say he need not have been quite so despondent, because many historical examples are available to him to justify his position. The most famous of all constituent assemblies was a French one, which had been summoned by the king in 1789, the Third Estate. And they are the ones who framed one of the most radical constitutions of the time. And if that example is to be followed, well, that is perfectly okay. And any number of such assemblies subsequently, or before and after, including the American, were all summoned by assemblies which are hardly representative, and certainly by the wrong person. The point is, all assemblies are summoned necessarily by a regime that is to be superseded. It cannot be summoned by itself, logically. And for that reason, whoever summons it, doesn't matter. So if the colonial state summoned the assembly, it did not disqualify it in that matter. But he had a grander vision of what would happen, what should have happened, and so he was rather disappointed about it. And he also could have been following or remembering what Victorian worthies like Leslie Stephen and Dicey had said about the Constitution. Their comments on the parliamentary sovereignty always noted, or both of them noted, one point. They said if Parliament were to pass a law, saying that all newborn babies with blue eyes are to be slaughtered, it is a perfectly legitimate one, and it has to be done. And then he asked the question, what would happen if such a law was passed? Would it actually happen, in fact? He said no. He said, first of all, some people have to be mad to pass such a law. And secondly, if it was passed, it would not be accepted. In effect, the argument was, and I think Nehru understood this very well, that there would be a revolution or some sort of a popular rising against these kinds of irrational laws. It could not pass. That is, democracy would assert itself when Parliament loses its mind in this fashion. And that is what he hoped would occur in India also. So it did not matter, really, which way it went. The best, it could go in any direction. And he's also alive to the fact that the best constitution in the world, the Weimar Constitution, produced Hitler. And a country which had no constitution, Britain, produced an ideal democratic system. So if you could have it that way, then why should you be so very bothered? I think he had these in mind also, but he had a disappointment, and therefore he eliminated the word democratic from the aims and objects at that time. And he merely called India, that the purpose of the assembly was to create an independent, sovereign republic. No democratic, no socialist, no secular. None of these famous words were included. He now faced his major challenge about the Constitution. What kind of a constitution? What is the purpose of that Constitution to be? If it was always meant to ensure change, he wanted a Constitution that would ensure, permit revolutionary change. He had major revolutionary changes in mind. Would this Constitution be able to do so? And if it was to do so, where is the stability that it will bring? He was permanently bothered about this. There has to be dynamism, but where is the stability with it? How do you ensure stability? And his greater fear was that a constitution once written tended to be inflexible. It tended to be rigidities of its own. And then where do you end up with such a constitution? Do you overthrow it or not? He warned of the danger of one generation legislating for subsequent generations. Thomas Paine's argument he presented. And the Constituent Assembly was very alive to that particular argument. So is this constitution meant to be forever? And how flexible was it going to be? This is a point that came up again and again. And it is still a live matter in India and in Indian jurisprudence. What is the core of the Constitution that can never be changed? It is called the basic structure. And there's been enormous amount of debate, and it is always assumed that that basic structure protects democracy, whatever else happens to the Constitution. But the big problem was the Constituent Assembly itself did not say what the basic structure was. The Constitution has not defined the basic structure, and Nehru has not said what the basic structure is. Nobody has. It is left to a group of judges who claim that there's a basic structure to define what the basic structure is. And all sorts of whimsical judgments have been coming. But nonetheless, people cling to it, hoping against hope that this is how democracy can be ensured, especially when you have the prime ministers who are overpowerful. It has happened under Indira Gandhi. It has happened again now. People are nervous about the possibilities. And therefore, they return to the basic structure argument. But the reason Nehru did not pursue any idea of a basic structure is that he wanted maximum flexibility. If you want change, you have to have the flexibility. And therefore, he said, allow it to be amended freely. Easy amendment was his answer to the nature of all the proposals of the amendment that came. Many said, if you're going to have a constitution, if it's meant to protect all the democratic values that it is enshrined in it, then you must make amendment difficult, especially of the fundamental rights and so on. He said, no, make it flexible. And it should be by simple majority that you should be able to do so. He, of all people, it is ironic, wanted it to be easily amended, and he preferred it that way. The reasons I've already suggested. He wanted flexibility, and he did not have an idea of a basic structure. But yet he admitted that a constitution is meant to be permanent. That's the purpose of having a constitution. You can't say it is just a bunch of laws. So what is it, the permanent core that he had in mind when he said that we need a constitution and have one? Well, reading all his speeches and the enormous amount of notation and so on that followed subsequently, and his various discussions, I would say this. His idea of the basic structure was just one, the independent sovereign republic. That was to be immutable, eternal, never to be compromised under any circumstances. But everything else could be changed, including the fundamental rights. And although he never directly said so, I think his feeling was fundamental rights could be abridged, but they could be recovered. But independence cannot be compromised because you may not recover it. So as long as you're independent, you can do whatever you want. If you lose that independence, you might lose everything with it. And so this is the core of it, the independent sovereign republic. And the rest of it is adjustable. And it is, as once again he fell back on his fundamental thesis, that democracy is protected by democracy, not by the Constitution and more laws. That is not how you do it. And so that would explain, I think, why he did not use the word democratic in the resolution aims and objects at that time. Now, the parliamentary institutions having been set up and India having become a formal parliamentary democracy, he was not satisfied with that. It was these parliamentary institutions existed only at the level of the Union in Delhi and all the states, what were called provinces in colonial times. After independence, they were called states of the Union. That's where they existed. That is a union parliament and the legislative assemblies. But he wanted to see democracy go down to the last village and to the last person, the last villager. Unless it was secure at the base, nothing was secure at the top. That was his argument. So it was a pyramid. The pyramid has to be unshakable. That base has to be utterly secure. So it had to reach the bottom. And that bottom was the panchayat. So below the legislative assembly were the village councils, the panchayats, the ancient village councils of history and of antiquity and medieval times, which is now going to extend into modern India down to the village level. And every man, woman, well, not child, but would be included. Now, this is here instantly we come across one of the ambiguities that is typical of Nehru. He wanted to be democratic and extend it all the way. At the same time, he saw it almost as a bureaucratic instrument of mobilizing and involving people in his developmental activities. So the panchayat, the local council, was both a democratically elected body, which is meant to replicate in some sense the parliaments and legislative assemblies above them, but they were also meant to be a bureaucratic extension. They were meant to assist the bureaucracy, assist the Planning Commission of Delhi and its subordinate bodies. They were to assist in all the developmental activities that are taking place through the cooperatives, the community development programs, the village handicrafts, the village schools, and so on. So all of development was their responsibility. It was a responsibility he assigned to them. It was his imposition almost upon them in a way that led to Jayaprakash Narayan calling it totalitarian. Jayaprakash was rather free with the word totalitarian, given his anarchistic inclination. But he said Parliament is totalitarian for this reason. He said nobody's asked for the panchayats, you are imposing it upon them, which is an important charge because you need democracy to come up from below. It should not be coming down from above. And this is exactly where he put his finger on the button, as it were, and said this is the wrong thing that is happening. And Nehru again and again seemed to talk of them as if they were a bureaucracy. He said they needed training, the members of the panchayats. Now, training is not what you normally give to civil servants. You do not give it to politicians. Politicians acquire experience. They are not trained. I wish they were, but they're not. In this case, he said they needed training. Then he kept on telling them, now it is your responsibility, we are giving you power. He talked of it as if he's distributing funds or an imperial boon to the subjects. It's now, we are giving you power, please exercise it wisely and properly and responsibly and acquire the training for it. In every way, he talked of, he had a vision that was rather top-down. It was distribution of welfare, in a way, democratic welfare. Ultimately, he merged democracy and bureaucracy through the panchayat at the bottom of the hierarchy. And the panchayats were something like a elected bureaucracy, in fact, at the village level. Of course, this is not exceptional in history. Many empires have elected bureaucracies. The imperial bureaucracies cannot enter the minutiae of village life, and therefore they order the election of the villagers to elect their elders, who then are absorbed into the imperial bureaucracy. That has happened many times, and in some vague way, in some unspecified way, this had a whiff of that procedure. But all put together, it was a typical Nehru cocktail of highly democratic, properly bureaucratic, developmental, and even conservative movements put together. I say conservative because he included the whole idea of village handicrafts and the revival of village traditions within this process of development. And the revival of village traditions and handicraft mobilized a particular form of local particularism, which is typical of conservatism, rather than of the radicalism of the militant like himself. It recalls, on the one hand, the revolutionary tendencies of the Narodniks in Russia, but also the conservative tendencies in preserving the village. And it, of course, reminds you of European conservatism again and again. Nehru took a leaf out of European conservatism in a very unlikely fashion, and certainly in this case he did. After all this, he reached the subject of electoral politics, his most important, the core of democracy. If it was a heart of democracy, to him it seemed to be a heart of darkness in many ways. He found that elections brought up the worst species, as it were, of the Indian people. It appealed to the worst type of person, and its sheer venality, its corruption, the sleaze, slush funds, and everything else that went with it dismayed him endlessly. He saw them as perpetually engaged in winning elections and preparing for the next round of elections, and never doing anything else in between except kicking out their competitors. So they were destructive in between elections, and during elections they spent their time buying votes. This distressed him enormously, and he is coming from the independence movement, which is inspired by such high ideals. But he expressed himself on this problem endlessly to anybody who chose to listen to him, all his confidence, from his sister Vijayalakshmi Pandit to Krishna Menon to Raja Gopalachari, Mountbatten, whoever. And he even periodically said, "I'm resigning from politics, I'm disgusted by what I see, I do not want any more of all this." And he agonized over this problem. He said, how can I continue being at the head of such a system which is going to be so corrupt? How is it possible? And he said, it is not possible for me to be a saint. Mahatma Gandhi can be a saint, he can be a martyr, he doesn't bother about the consequences. He can become a martyr. He's a prophet after all. He said, I cannot be. I have to lead, I have to run the system. And I have to carry the system with all its flaws. So he accepted that there were so many flaws that he was heading it and he had to manage as best he could. But he was deeply upset and horrified about it, that he was running a system which is actually fundamentally corrupt. And what would he do about it? He could not do very much. But of course, there's a familiar problem amongst revolutionary leaders. After a revolution, after great achievement, they're disillusioned, always. I just need to remind you of Lenin's disillusion after the revolution. And he's actually planning a coup against his henchman, Stalin. The famous dying years of Lenin are so well recorded. But it's not only Lenin. Stalin himself, having come through the first 5-year plan, the industrialization, the collectivization, the enormous success of it, but at whatever cost it was, between 1936 and 1938, he slaughtered the entire leadership of the party, of the defense establishment, and God knows, of the intelligentsia, and God knows who else. There was such bloodletting that it's difficult for historians even now to explain why he was doing it. And certainly one of the explanations, as good as any other, is that he felt that these are people who are settling down to enjoying the fruits of victory, the victory of the revolution of collectivization and industrialization that had taken place. And they shall not sit down to enjoy it. They must retain their dynamism. In order to retain it, to get rid of them, and a new range of people have to come up. That was his idea. And so he did it in this way. Of course, he never explained it. Why? Mao Zedong also comes to mind in the Cultural Revolution. But the person who expressed it best, I must read to you, is Genghis Khan. That's a surprising person, you might say. But this is what he said, in the words of Rashid ad-Din, as recounted to us by René Grousset. Genghis Khan said, "After us, the people of our race will be draped in gold. They will consume sweet and greasy food, ride magnificent mounts, and embrace the most attractive women. And they will forget that they owe all these things to us." So, after great achievement, you're going to have a bunch of corrupt people enjoying life. And he despised the lot. It happens again and again. This is a running theme in all his books, also. As the rise and fall of civilizations that he was recording in his books, why do they rise and why do they fall? Why do they decline? This is a substantial element. And it recalls very much Nietzsche's comments, or what Zarathustra felt as he heard the prophecy of the soothsayer. This is exactly this. The eternal return of mediocrity. This is what they're always afraid of. Great people always fear this, and Nehru feared just that. But reflecting upon his historical forebears may not have been much consolation to him. He still had to deal with what he saw, and that he had to preside over it. His other fear, and next fear, was the problem of oligarchy, or the emergence of an elective aristocracy as a result of successful democratic politics. That people are elected, once elected, they form a professional caste of politicians themselves, who lord it over, in anything but a democratic fashion, over the rest of the public and the populace. It has been recorded, this has a critique of modern society, modern democratic politics that has been made again and again, usually what's called critique of mass societies, from the late 19th century all the way into his times, by a host of people, the most famous being Michel, the Schumpeter, and so on. But the problem was that this is a continuous process, that we cannot avoid it. Max Weber described it with great authority as the most important and powerful form of domination in modern politics, bureaucracy. Lenin was the greatest theorist of democracy and revolution. It is bureaucracy, the greatest theorist of bureaucracy and revolution. It is a bureaucracy which will make the revolution safe. And he constructed his Leninist party on that basis, and split it on that basis also. Trotsky analyzed the Stalinist system as the emergence of a new bureaucracy, the new ruling class in this fashion. But it came again and again, and Lenin and Nehru found he was facing the same problems that all democratic systems do. Again, it is small consolation that this is already a common critique of European politics. It had occurred so many times. And people like Robert Michels had described in great detail how the politics of the socialist parties in Germany and Italy were bureaucratized, and a professional group of politicians were running it all the time. That is, and he chose the socialist parties particularly because they were the democratic ones more than anybody else. Heinrich Herkner showed it in the case of the German unions, and Sidney and Beatrice Webb described in considerable detail, and these are authors that Nehru knew, about the process of competitive exams for being union officials in the unions in Britain. And they even call them, the Webbs call these people civil servants, perfectly normally, not ironically. So if this process of bureaucratization was so common right across the spectrum, here he need not have been so unhappy. But it's a result of having come through a revolutionary process and having been through the independence movement that he saw all this as deplorable. But more than bureaucracy within these movements, it is a threatening one-party dictatorship that he was worried about. how far is it going to go? There was only one party ever in Nehru's time, all the 17 years that he was there, and he was the leader of it. He admitted that one party should never be permanent. It would tend to become despotic, and there will be corruption setting in. Everyone adhered theoretically to the two-party ideal, but India never had a two-party system all the time that he was there. And an effective two-party system has come about only from the late 90s. In colonial times, there had been no experience of a two-party system in spite of elections and political parties competing. The colonial state did not depend upon parliamentary majorities to run, although they were not, of course, responsible to it, but not even to the extent that Imperial Germany and Imperial Russia were. So there was no such tradition here. Everybody was equally committed to the idea of having a vibrant opposition. Nehru was. And he was so unhappy that there was not an opposition, there was not another party waiting to form a government, that he even suggested to the Congress Party that, look, you people should lose a few elections to look convincing. To that extent he went, to satisfy the theoretical requirement of having an opposition. He tried to argue that there is an opposition. In fact, there are 150 members of parliament who are very capable, intelligent, and effective leaders of an opposition. The point is they were not a government in waiting, however capable they were. The communists and the socialists were very able parliamentarians, very intelligent and well-educated in themselves, but certainly they did not constitute an opposition. And when he saw all this, his greater dismay was that actually there was another kind of opposition forming. That is a factional opposition within the Congress Party. From within the party, there would be factions which would join hands with non-Congress members and form a pressure group against him. And he sometimes said, the opposition seems to be within my own party. Who says there's no opposition? He was actually exasperated, and he would scold the Congress Parliamentary Party like any housemaster in a public school. But finally, the result of it, his whole experience of it, of 17 years of running this, he came to a surprising theory, surprising from him, that India was creating a party system that resembled something of a party state, like the Soviet Union. This is Nehru saying it, not his opponents, not his enemies. He compared Indian party politics to the European ones and the Soviet ones. And he argued that in the Soviet one, the party and the state were conflated, in a sense. They were identical. They did the same job. Two bureaucracies. In the European system, he cited the British example, the parties organized the elections and then set up and then withdrew. And the government went about the business of running the country with the permanent bureaucracy. In India, the party organized the elections, the government ran the country through the bureaucracy, and the party participated in the governance of the country alongside the bureaucracy, especially in all the developmental activities, be it in the panchayats or planning or whatever. They were simultaneously, or alongside the bureaucracy, very active. So he called this something of a party state between the British or the European and the Soviet systems. And it's surprising that it comes from a person like him. So his theory of the politics and of the party system, as it emerged at that time, as he saw it, was that before independence you had a whole movement, a series of movements which came under the umbrella called the national movement, led by Gandhi. And so it was all the movements rumbling on, heading towards independence, with the Congress Party in the leadership. And the Congress Party itself was a movement. Now, they were converting themselves into parties after 1947, and he saw it as a movement becoming a party, a sort of movement party. But it had not fully become a party because it was dominant all the way. So it was a movement perpetually, and he saw it as practically a good thing. A movement is always more dynamic than a party which tends to be rigid and settled into its own bureaucracy and its own traditions. So it was all these movement becoming a party, prevailing over a two-party system. That is how he saw it. And it was something of a party state, eventually. In spite of that, he saw it quite clearly as a two-ideology system, not two-party system. The Congress secular ideology, called secularism broadly in the country, opposed to communalism, led by the Hindu nationalists, Hindutva, the Jansangh then, now the Bharatiya Janata Party, the BJP, but also including Muslim communalism, Sikh communalism, and to a very limited extent, in very narrow circumstances, perhaps Christian. But the main one was the Hindu communalists, because they were the largest, and 80% majority, or nearly 80%. So it was there was a division between two movements. They had not formed into two parties, but they were very clearly two movements. And whenever he campaigned, during those three general elections, 1952, 57 to 62, it was as one movement against another movement, not as one party against other parties. He thought of himself as leading a movement, and he mobilized throughout a movement exactly as he had done before 1947. And when the Swatantra Party was finally formed in 1959, he almost welcomed it, saying, at long last, something of an opposition party has formed. Because the communal movement had not yet formed a party. The Jansangh was a failure in parliamentary politics. So when a Swatantra Party was formed, it was a conservative party. Conservative in the sense that, well, up to a point you can say European conservatives are meant to be, but actually he called it totally reactionary, living off the princes and decaying landlords and the rest, and anything but modern and progressive and forward-looking. Nothing really like European conservatism. But because it was a conservatism of this type, and that it was secular, it was not communal, he practically welcomed it while making fun of it and deriding it at every stage. In the hope, I think, that finally the divide in Indian politics between secularism and communalism would be replaced by social democracy and conservatism. Of course, it didn't happen, but that was, I think, his brief hope that a two-party system of this kind might come. But effectively, it was only a two-ideology system. And throughout his tenure, he never had to bother about an opposition. It never happened. And he's always trying to find out why and what it is going to become after his time. But with these problems behind him, as it were, his greatest problem of all was to deal with what is called minorities. Now, democracy brought with it always a problem of what's called the tyranny of majorities. Not yet the yoke of opinion, that is not yet a problem in India, but certainly the tyranny of majorities. So what do you do about that? There is a majority of Hindus over Muslims, and is there a danger of the minorities being trampled upon? He was obviously very concerned about that, as indeed all liberals were. His answer throughout, the first step was that the individual rights, as enshrined in the Constitution, would guarantee the security of every individual, whether they belong to a majority or a minority community. That's a first step. That is the purpose of having the fundamental rights. But he also knew that given majorities, that will never be the case. You will always be, the majority will have its way. And then how do you handle it? But he did not dismiss the community, or rather he shifted the focus of attention, I think, from majority and minority to individual and community. He was not obsessed with the fact of majority. That he kept as a background. He understood that this is a real problem and it will continue. But it was individual versus community that he was more bothered about. And if that relationship could be stabilized and the community could become individuals in any way, then he's achieved his objective. He also realized that that is not so very easy. The community is very real. The community has a life of its own, and individuals see themselves fulfilled through the community, not as just individuals. And you have to provide for that, and that is not happening. Or it is not going to happen in a great hurry. A community is not an association. It is not the sum of the individuals constituting the association. But he shifted as much as possible to these. And he saw India with its immense complexity consisting of 4 major communities at least. The national linguistic one, the linguistic community, the religious one, the caste, and the tribal. And he had to devise a politics which will take account of the lives of these communities and provide for individual rights without any community being oppressed by any majority at any stage. Now that is a tall order. So to deal with the first of the communities that he is concerned about, the national community. The national community consisted of 2 levels. One was the Indian nation itself. That was a community, which is what most people consider ultimately a community. The rest are meant to be individuals and classes. But in India, you had a series of linguistic communities, the linguistic states, as they became, which were constituent nations of the Indian nation. So the Indian nation itself is constructed at 2 levels of a series of nations combining to form a bigger nation. They did not actually combine to form the nation. No, that would be a wrong way of putting it. The Indian nation consisted of these constituent nations. They grew simultaneously. Their nationalisms have almost developed simultaneously from the late 19th century. And they resolved themselves into territorial nations in the course of the 1950s, a period that Nehru presided over. Through the states reorganization, all that followed. Now, these 2 sets of communities had to be integrated into one nation. Now, how is that to be done? He was very nervous about it. The reason was that India had just gone through the partition. The trauma of the partition, of course, was terrible for everyone, and they feared that any further division of India into linguistic states might lead to further partitions. And the Dravidian movement was itself secessionist already in Tamil Nadu. So would that in fact lead to yet another movement for a partition? Nobody knew at that time, and he couldn't take things for granted. But he repeatedly said that already in 1920, the Congress Party had committed itself to the linguistic states, that is, to linguistic provinces and mobilization on the basis of language. And that particular form of politics had already come into being. It is just now being regularized and constitutionalized in the course of the 1950s. That is how he explained the creation of the Andhra Pradesh state in 1953, and then the linguistic reorganization in 1956, and subsequently the division of Bombay state into Gujarat and Maharashtra, and his ready acceptance, after a certain amount of negotiation, of the state of Nagaland, which was secessionist, revolutionary, militant in every way, but he followed it up. So he had seen that this has a potential for democratic consolidation, despite all his reluctance. And his reluctance was great, one should remember. And the reason he saw it was that Indian national politics reproduced themselves in each state. That is, their national parties played their role in tandem with the regional parties, and they together linked up. Either the regional parties would play a role in Delhi, in national politics, or the national parties would play their own role in the regional politics. And their integration in this fashion actually led to the consolidation and stabilization of Indian democratic politics. It led to a certain kind of deepening of democracy, the kind of thing that he would have been most pleased about eventually, though he did not live long enough to celebrate it. One can't say that it is a success. Nothing is a success. But certainly, for a long time, it has been a stable process. And the sheer multiplication of states in India after that indicates how much is possible. And this process that India has been through, we forget. You can see traces of it in two major unions outside India, the Soviet Union and the European Union. The Soviet Union is a case of multiple nations constituting the Soviet nation. And the Soviet Union did consider itself a nation. And it is a very formal structure, a real hierarchy of powers amongst the constituent nations. The European Union has not yet been able to create that, but it is meant to be a series of nations forming one larger entity, which Europeans do not want to call a nation because of their history and bad experience of nationalism, but in some sense, that's exactly what it is to be. Never mind the nomenclature, but the structure is of a similar kind. But the European Union is far away from it yet, especially after Brexit, but the Indian Union did go ahead with it, and it is continuing with it, as we can see. So this is a case where the community and the individual and the nation all combined in a fruitful fashion, and so far it has. Of course, there have been challenges in Punjab, in parts of the northeast, in Kashmir, without a doubt, but otherwise it has held. And Nehru saw them, these states forming the Union of India, and India itself contributing to a federation of states in the world, in the manner of Mazzini, a confederation finally. So Indian nationalism was not going to be limited to India. It is not to be total. It has to be qualified. It must surrender some of its sovereignty in the cause of a confederation that will be global. That was his Mazzinian idea, which he could not, which is one reason why he was such an active player in the United Nations and all its politics. He is very committed to it. But the other community, and this was the greatest problem of all, was a religious one. Here there's a real case of majority and minority, which there was not in the case of the states. I might just briefly mention. The linguistic states, there's no majority nation. There's no what is called a Staatsvolk, a people who created the Union by conquest and domination, in the way the Russians created the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, or the English created the British nation. In India, there's no such. The Hindi-speaking people might be the largest number in the country, but they're a minority also, but they certainly did not create the Indian Union by any stretch of imagination, except in their own, to some extent. And that, of course, has been dismissed by everybody else in the rest of the country. But when it came to the religious community, he faced his greatest challenge. Here there was a huge majority, between 75 and 80% of Hindus, over a series of other minorities, the largest being Muslims, about 15%, the rest being Sikhs and Christians and others. Now, in this case, how does a majority function, and would it dominate and terrorize the minority? The reason it was such a problem is that Hindus were forming into, or a Hindu nationalist party was trying to unite Hindus into a single community as a majority, with in the image of Christians and Muslims as a single undifferentiated religion. The problem was, of course, that Hinduism has any number of castes. It is not united in the way that Islam and Christianity are. And in India, Islam and Christianity and Sikhs are also divided by caste, not officially, but in real practice. It's a very serious internal problem of theirs. So caste is a reality, and within Hinduism, caste defines Hinduism. There is no doctrine which unites Hindus. It is caste which unites them, or one of the things, shall I say, one of the most important ways you can comprehend it. But the attempt to create a majority by unifying all Hindus was a serious problem in itself, a challenge that he had to face. Now, his answers to that problem were at several levels. Besides all the constitutional arguments and all the administrative procedures about protecting minorities, protecting individuals, ensuring their constitutional rights, and so on, he pursued all those. he made the historical argument that if Hindus and Muslims have been in India for 1,200 years and they've made a life together, they cannot be in a state of permanent enmity and conflict. It's not possible. They have created a life together. And if it has occurred in the past century at best, and it has been generated by Hindu nationalist revivalism, which wants to create that enmity. It is inflamed by them, and by colonial theorists and Orientalists and so on, who claim that Hindus and Muslims have been at each other's throats for all their existence in the subcontinent. Now, so he argued against that historical vision and proffered his own, which is that a syncretic culture had in fact emerged, and there were joint ways of living, and the politics of it had also combined. After all, Mughals and Rajputs and so on had been firm allies. In spite of Indian nationalism presenting Rajputs as heroic fighters against Muslim and Mughal domination, the Rajputs are actually allies of the Mughals, as history, that is, a historian will show. But his further argument was that if this is the case, the democratic movements will dissolve these conflicts. Remember his argument about adult suffrage, how far it can go. And that must necessarily happen. It is the elites who are promoting these forms of conflict. So you're going to have, if there is real democracy, you can overcome it. The next was the ideology and practice of secularism. This meant not only the protection of individuals and their rights as provided in the Constitution, but also that no religion shall be superior to any other, shall have no privilege over any other, whatever their numbers. Each religion shall have equal rights as any other, and they must be able to exist freely in every way, with all the constitutional guarantees of autonomy of minority institutions and educational practices. But also that the state shall not privilege any one religion. It shall be neutral between them, was his further demand. So there is no question of any of these coming into conflict if the state functions according to the principles of secularism. That was his particular responsibility as the head of it. But religions were not subsets of the nation in the manner that the linguistic states were. So it will not reproduce the politics of the nation within each religion. It has to be guaranteed in this form constitutionally and administratively. But it is possible, especially if you can carry out an ideological campaign about the history of it all. His further theory, he relied upon the theory of secularization, which is that with all the developments of modernization that are taking place, the individual will choose his religion rather than be compelled to adopt it. Even if you're born into a religion, it will not necessarily be imperative. You can make a choice by your late teens, and like you make choices about everything else. Religion will be one of those. So it will not have that commanding influence that it used to have. And he looked forward to that very much. And if this was the case, then all his campaigns, his speech-making, etc., were all oriented to promoting individuality, artistic freedom, the scientific temper, secularism, and the reminder of history and the syncretic culture. He goes on and on about all these. One of the reasons his speeches might be boring is for this reason. He repeats all these themes in every speech. But the very fact that he's haranguing all the time is reminding the entire population of the country that this is the case and you can pursue it. And always it was a theme he took from Thomas Huxley, who used it in another context of evolutionary theory. The stronger is not necessarily the better. And that point he drove home again and again. But after religion came the caste community. Now, how do you deal with this? Here there are no majorities and minorities. He had to reconcile the individual and the community all over again. And all the injustices of India were concentrated within the practice of caste. More than one religion dominating another. It came here, although there was no question of minority and majority. So the discourse on minorities did not help in this case. And his answer was affirmative action. And what is not called, what now known in India as reservations. But he reserved it only for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, as in the Constitution. He thought that was enough. Indian politics has subsequently extended it across the board, and we have a whole system of constitutionally created castes through the system of reservations of jobs in government and reservations of seats in educational institutions. And this is to correct all the injustices of the past that had afflicted India throughout these years. But the question is, what did he see as a future of caste? He was just beginning to see caste being used as a basis for mobilizing political support. He thought caste in terms of a traditional irrationality and traditional excrescence, as it were, which must be eliminated under any circumstance. It was the manner in which all progressive Indian reformers since the 19th centuries had looked at it. But now something else was happening to caste. Caste was as a basis of political mobilization. Very few realize that actually the Dravidian movement had done all that already for 30 years before independence. And it's only when North India also began to dabble in it that people got so concerned. Now, this particular line of development, he did not come to theorize upon. He could have done two things. That is, the caste development would split Hindutva and the Hindu consolidation. He would not have dreamt of promoting caste against religion because he disliked caste. He could not. To him, that would be crass opportunism. He would not have done it. But he noted the fact that it is happening. The further point is that if it was happening, it was on a democratic basis. It is actually expanding democratic empowerment in a way that he never expected at all. And he could not quite understand what is happening. It is only much later that we have seen how it has happened, and many people still think it is irrational, but it is not quite as irrational as we might assume. The result is that these particular forms of community and individual rights came together under him, and he saw the manner in which completely incompatible principles were being married into one political system and one constitutional system. He didn't have a full theory about it, and he would not have a theory because he despised theory. He suspected theorists or theoreticians, as Marxists would say, because they always confuse a picture by imposing excessive clarity. Life was so full of contradictions, and so many incompatibilities had to be merged, that if you are to run this country, you have to manage all these. This is his element, in a sense. Refusal to engage in theory, being theoretically aware nonetheless, and managing incompatibilities and stitching them together as much as possible. And he did them. And if he had any doubt about it, he could have looked across the seas, and I think he did. American democracy is based upon a fundamental contradiction. It is based upon racism, or a racist presence. And if for 200 years it has survived, through racism and all its, through slavery and all that followed up to now, why, nobody has yet created a theory of democracy based on racism. But American democracy flourishes. In Britain, a model democratic country at that time, and considered always so, had hereditary privilege at the pinnacle, not merely the monarchy, but in the House of Lords, and all that it implied. So these completely incompatible principles were brought together for flourishing democracies. Why couldn't this also be possible here? You could have caste mobilizations, and individual simultaneously. You could have community mobilization and individual simultaneously. And interestingly, none of the community mobilizers ever questioned individual rights. They always defended it. That was constitutionally sacred. But all the rest went with it. So India, he saw evolving a peculiar combination so full of contradictions, typical of the country, in a manner that was greater than anywhere else in the world, to have these forms of communities, 4 forms, all coming together along with individual rights, and yet creating a democracy out of it. There's no theory for it, but there's a practice, and that is what he saw was coming. But he didn't leave it to that, if you'll allow me a moment. He said, after all this, you still need a moral ideal to make it acceptable, to energize it. The moral ideal he held forth was Gandhi himself. Now, this is the extraordinary ambiguity in it. Gandhi was no democrat under any circumstances. He was a complete autocrat who told his followers that if I am a leader, I will decide, and none of you can expel me. None of you can disobey me. You may only expel me whenever you wish. And with an iron hand, he ruled the party and the movement that he led, and he led so successfully. But he idealized him for all those virtues of simplicity, courage, leadership, and sympathy for human beings, and so on. He extolled his virtues in every speech, wherever possible. This was a model man, a model leader. But it was not a democrat. He was so superior to everybody. Nehru himself said, such a man is born once every few centuries. We seldom see such people. He presented him, in fact, as a semi-divine person, as an avatar of divinity, and really speaking, as an avatar of Buddha. That is what he saw him as. So superior a person is obviously not a democrat. He was more like the overman, the Nietzsche's overman, who was capable of so transforming himself as to create, through self-transcendence, create a new type of human being, the overman. This is what Gandhi was. He was also presented to the Indian public as a sage of antiquity, as a rishi of antiquity who could make the gods bend to his will. But it was a combination of a rishi and an overman. That was the personality of Gandhi that he presented to the Indian public. The one thing he was not is a democrat. He was not an average person. He was not the man in the street. He was not the common man, the Aam Admi, or anything remotely like it. It is quite the opposite. And the other great moral ideal was Buddha. Buddha was a person, again, certainly not democratic. You can't think of him in democratic terms, but of such superior moral virtues. But the chief virtues he chose were his capacity for compassion and for finding the golden mean. He worked the golden mean throughout. And that is a model to be followed in his form of rulership. These 2 ideals he presented as virtues that Democrats have to follow, although these persons were not democratic, and these are not necessarily democratic ideals. They're not at all the average. But there's a third ideal he presented, which was himself. Now, this is curious. He never once said, I am an ideal. That he would not. Thank you for the reminder. He functioned as a model democrat in every way. Perfect parliamentarian, perfectly respectful of the judiciary and of the press, of individual rights, and unfailingly courteous to all his opponents, and so on. But the ambiguity of it is that his immense popularity allowed him dictatorial powers, in fact. He had overriding powers, and he claimed periodically in the Constituent Assembly that I am speaking to the people. In a sense saying, I'm not talking to you, I'm talking to the people over you. They are the ones who have presented me with all their ideas, and your job is to rubber stamp it, more or less, and that is the way he spoke. He was so superior, so far ahead of the whole of the Congress leadership, that, as I said, Jayaprakash Narayan once asked him to become the new Mahatma, to play the role of the Mahatma himself, which he declined. But he could, as a result of that very superior position, he played the role of a teacher. He himself lectured all the time. His speeches were more like lectures. Lectures on Indian history and culture and world history. Those were the favorite themes. on which he's written those books. And he said, I know I'm sometimes speaking like a professor to you. He was teaching all the time from this very great height. He wrote to his chief ministers every fortnight, teaching them world politics, Indian politics, and a whole lot of other things. He was constantly didactic about it. Speaking from such great heights, one always got the impression that he was conducting a civilizing mission, in fact. There's a whiff of it in the way he taught them how to be democratic, how to understand world politics, and how to understand a whole lot of other things. But whatever else it was, he always turned to the people for guidance. He was instinctively a democrat. And if he was not able to talk to the people, he was depressed. People have noted this. And when he went and gave a speech, he was energized all over again, enthusiastic. It's as if in case of doubt, he went and spoke to the people as if they were an oracle or a soothsayer. And he found answers, and he found his energy returning, which was subsiding earlier with all the crises that were besetting him. So he's a person who doubted at every point and assembled all the contradictions you can think of. A constitution with parliamentary sovereignty, which should not have been. A democracy at the roots, which is a bureaucracy also in the panchayat system. Political parties engendering oligarchies. And the one-party system becoming a semi-party state, by his own admission. But instead of having a two-party system, having two ideology system, and reconciling all the time individual and community. And his attempt always to absorb his opponents through a continuous process of consensus building. That is his response to the absence of a two-party system. He kept on absorbing them, creating a movement, rather than treating them as adversaries. One reason why he's so popular, but that is a response to the absence of two parties. It is perpetually a movement over and over again. And he presented these contradictory ideals, non-democratic ideals of Gandhi, of Buddha, and even of himself as the democratic dictator. And it is perhaps this range of doubts, doubting everything, doubting himself, seeing the ambiguity in every situation, that made him so popular. Somehow people felt they were included in that area of doubt which he constantly expressed. And he was immensely popular. And in all the correspondence, I found only two persons who were ever offensive to him. Otherwise, even communists got sentimental over him. During his life, in spite of his dismissing a communist government in Kerala. But there it was. And those two persons, well, there's one general who thought he knew better than Nehru about everything, and of course Ram Manohar Lohia, the only other person who upset Nehru by his offensive language. But otherwise, he was adored across the board. And the reason, perhaps, is that he doubted himself. Thank you very much. I'm sorry.